Hello and welcome to my channel. Sit back, close your eyes, focus on the story, find a piece of yourself within it, and drift off to sleep in peace. Subscribe, and please leave a comment. A misty morning in the hills of medieval Japan, where a lone rider moves along a narrow mountain road, armor plates clinking softly with each step of his horse, a sword resting at his side that he has trained his entire life to draw without hesitation. This is the world of the samurai. A warrior class that shaped nearly 7 centuries of Japanese history, from the rise of provincial military families in the 10th century to the final dissolution of their privileged status. The image many carry today. A lone masterless swordsman bound by an ancient, unbroken code of honor is only part of far more complicated and in many ways more interesting truth. Samurai were not simply warriors. Across their long history, they served as estate managers, tax collectors, poets, government officials, and during the centuries of peace that eventually settled over Japan, administrators who rarely drew a blade in anger at all. This is the story of who the samurai actually were, how their way of life took shape, and how it changed dramatically across the centuries. Built not on myth, but on the historical record they themselves left behind. Chapter 2: Before the Sword, the Land. The origins of the samurai lie not on a battlefield, but in the countryside of Heian period Japan, roughly the 9th through 12th centuries, a time when the imperial court in Kyoto held formal authority, but struggled to maintain direct control over increasingly distant provinces. As the central government's ability to police and administer remote regions weakened, wealthy landowning families in the provinces began organizing private armed forces to protect their estates from banditry, rival clans, and the general instability of frontier life. These early warriors drawn from both minor aristocratic families and the rural elite, developed particular skill in mounted archery, a discipline that would remain central to samurai warfare for centuries before the sword itself became their most iconic weapon. The Korinto, unable or unwilling to maintain its own effective military, increasingly relied on these provincial warrior bands to suppress rebellions and enforce order. A dependency that steadily transferred real power away from the aristocratic capital and toward the armed families who could actually project force. By the late Heian period, warrior clans such as the Minamoto and the Taira had grown powerful enough to influence imperial politics directly, setting the stage for the warrior class to seize a formal political authority in the century that followed. Chapter 3: The Shogunate takes shape. In Inyo de Sapsi Campeche, After a prolonged conflict known as the Genpei War, the Minamoto clan emerged victorious over its tire rivals, and its leader, Minamoto no Yoritomo, established a new form of government centered not in the imperial capital, but in the eastern town of Kamakura. This new government, known as a shogunate, placed a military leader, the shogun, at the head of the country's actual administration, while the emperor in Kyoto retained ceremonial and religious authority, but lost most practical political power. This arrangement marked a fundamental shift in Japanese governance that would persist, with interruptions and modifications, for nearly 700 years. Under the Kamakura shogunate, samurai were formally organized into a structured military and administrative system, granted land and positions in exchange for loyalty and service to their lord, a relationship that historians often compare to European feudalism, though Japanese scholars caution against overstating the similarity given then distinct legal, cultural, and religious frameworks involved. Provincial samurai now served as land stewards and constables on behalf of the shogunate, collecting taxes, maintaining order, and mustering string for military campaigns when called upon, a role that combined the warrior's traditional martial function with genuine administrative responsibility from the very beginning of their rise to power. Chapter 4: The Idea of Bushido and its Real History. Modern, popular culture often presents the samurai as bound from earliest times by a fixed ancient code called Bushido, a term meaning roughly the way of the warrior. Historical evidence tells a more nuanced story. While concepts of loyalty, martial skill, and honor certainly mattered to samurai throughout their history, the formalized, codified version of Bushido that most people recognize today was largely articulated during the peaceful Edo period, particularly the 17th and 18th centuries. Further popularized by writers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, well after the age of constant port warfare had ended. Earlier medieval samurai operated under looser, regionally varied warrior ethics that placed heavy emphasis on personal reputation, family, honor, and loyalty to one's immediate lord. But these ideals were not written down as a single unified philosophy until centuries later, when samurai themselves, no longer regularly engaged in combat, began reflecting on and formalizing what their warrior identity was meant to represent. This does not make the values less genuine to the people who held them. But it does mean that the popular image of an ancient, unchanging Jing warrior code obscures a far more gradual and historically layered development, one shaped as much by the peaceful bureaucratic centuries as by the violent ones. that came before them. Chapter 5: A Warrior from Childhood. Becoming a samurai was not a decision made in an adulthood. It was a path shaped from early childhood within a warrior household. Sons of samurai families began training in martial skills, particularly archery and horsemanship in the earlier centuries, and swordsmanship increasingly from the late medieval period onward, often and starting well before the age of 10. This physical training was paired with instruction in reading, writing, and, particularly during the peaceful Edo period, Confucian classics and moral philosophy. Since a samurai in later the centuries was expected to be a capable administrator and scholar as much as a warrior. Discipline within these households was strict, and young samurai were raised with a strong emphasis on self-control, composure under pressure, and unwavering loyalty to their family and lord. Girls born into samurai families also received distinct training, often including the use of a short weapon called the naginata, a bladed polearm woman. A polearm woman in some warrior house learns to defend their homes in the absence of male relatives or rixes. Male relatives, alongside education in household management, etiquette, and, in many families, literacy and the arts. This early, immersive upbringing meant that by the time a young samurai reached adulthood, martial, skill, and nokat retspind, refinement were both already deeply embedded. Not separate pursuits, but two halves of the same expected identity. Chapter 6: Steel, Silk, and Armor. The samurai sword, known in Japanese as the katana, holds an almost mythic status in popular imagination today. Its dominance as the primary samurai weapon developed gradually, and was, for much of samurai history, secondary to the bow. Mounted archery remained the defining skill of the early and mid-medieval samurai, and the term historians sometimes use for this early warrior ideal. The way of the horse and bow reflects that priority. The sword grew in prominence particularly from the formed 14th century onward, as warfare shifted toward more frequent close combat. But in infantry engagement, and Japanese swordsmith developed increasingly refined forging techniques, folding and tempering steel to create blades combining a hard, sharp edge with a more flexible core capable of withstanding impact without shattering. Samurai armor evolved alongside these changing battlefield needs. Early designs favoring lightweight, flexible construction suited to mounted archery, with lacquered leather and iron scales laced together with colorful silk cords, while later armor, particularly during the intensive warfare of their 16th century, incorporated heavier plate elements influenced in part by contact with European firearms and armor design following Portuguese traders' arrival in Japan. Far from a static tradition, samurai equipment reflected a continuously adapting response to the real demands of the battlefield across centuries of changing warfare. Chapter 7: Years of War. The period from the late 15th through 16th century, known as the Sengoku or Warring States period, represented the most intense and sustained era of samurai warfare in Japanese history. Central shogunal authority had effectively collapsed, and regional warlords, known as daimyo, fought continuously for territory and dominance across a fractured, war-torn country. This was the era that produced many of the figures most famous in later popular memory warlords who rose through military skill and political maneuvering to control Anton-Troyer provinces, commanding samurai armies that had grown far larger and more organized than the smaller warrior bands of earlier Genturius. Introduced by Portuguese traders in the mid-16th century, transformed battlefield tactics within a remarkably short spine. And by the century's end, samurai armies incorporated matchlock gunners alongside a traditional mounted and infantry forces, a genuine tactical revolution that some Japanese commanders adopted too, with real sophistication. The Sengoku period finally drew toward a close through the successive efforts of three major unifying figures: Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and finally Tokugawa Ieyasu, whose decisive victory at the Battle of Sekigahara in the year Binakusetsu effectively ended the large-scale civil warfare and set stage for the long era of peace that would fundamentally reshape what it meant to be a samurai. Chapter 8: Peace and a New Kind of Warrior. With Tokugawa Ieyasu's establishment of a new shogunate in Inaksunaturich, Japan entered a period of sustained internal peace that would last more than 2.5 centuries. A dramatic transformation for a warrior class whose identity had been built around military conflict. Deprived of regular warfare, samurai increasingly took on roles as administrators, bureaucrats, tax officials, and scholars within the domains of their lords, their swords becoming as much a symbol of social status and legal privilege as a practical weapon. The Tokugawa government formalized a strict social hierarchy that placed samurai at the top, above farmers, artisans, and merchants, and restricted the right to carry two swords, the long katana and shorter companion blade, exclusively to samurai as a visible marker of their rank. Yet this elevated status came with genuine financial strain for many. Samurai received fixed stipends, typically paid in rice, from their lords, and as the Edo period progressed and the merchant economy grew increasingly sophisticated and cash-based, many samurai families found their fixed incomes, failing to keep pace with rising costs, leading some into real financial hardship, despite their high formal social standing. This long peace, ironically, is also when the philosophical and ethical writings most associated with Bushido were composed as samurai scholars reflected on what their warrior heritage meant in an age without war to define it. Chapter 9: The Way of Zen and the Warrior's Mind. Religious and philosophical practice played a significant role in shaping samurai identity, particularly the influence of Zen Buddhism, which gained considerable popularity among the warrior class beginning in the Kamakura period. Zen's emphasis on discipline, direct experience, and mental comportment resonated strongly with samurai seeking to cultivate calm focus in the face of mortal danger, and many prominent samurai patronized Zen monasteries, studied meditation, and incorporated Zen aesthetic principles in arts closely. Associated with warrior culture, including the tea ceremony, ink painting, and garden design. This connection should not be overstated into a claim that all samurai were devout Zen practitioners. Religious practice among the warrior class was genuinely varied, with Pure Land Buddhism, Shinto observance, and Confucian ethics, particularly during Edo period, also shaping samurai belief. Behavior in significant ways. What Zen offered in particular was a practical framework for confronting fear and impermanence, ideas that held obvious relevance for men whose lives, this alliance, especially in earlier centuries, could end suddenly and violently in battle. The cultural refinement associated with later samurai, skill in poetry, calligraphy, and aesthetic pursuits developed alongside this religious and philosophical engagement, producing the distinctive combination of martial and artistic identity that came to define the ideal of the cultivated warrior. In the peaceful Edo centuries. Chapter 10: The Sword Set Down. The samurai era came to its formal end in the second half of the 19th century, following the arrival of American naval forces under Commodore Matthew Perry in Ife in Seix and the subsequent political upheaval that culminated in the Meiji Restoration of Iki Estacisen of Facen species. The new Meiji government, seeking to rapidly modernize Japan and build a centralized nation-state capable of resisting Western colonial pressure, systematically dismantled the feudal domain system and, with it, the legal and social privileges that had defined samurai status for centuries. The government abolished samurai stipends, converting them into government bonds that often proved insufficient for long-term financial security. And in CC Zamseals, formerly banned upon the public carrying of swords, stripping away the most visible symbol of samurai identity. Many former samurai adapted successfully to the new order, moving into government service, business, education, and the newly formed National Army and police forces. Role is that in some ways continued the administrative and discipline traditions their families had practiced for generations. Others resisted this transformation, most notably in the Satsuma Rebellion of in Ipsi Shamside, a final, unsuccessful armed uprising led by former samurai against the very Meiji government their class had helped establish. By the close of the 19th century, the samurai, as a distinct legal and social class, had ceased to exist. Yet the historical reality of who they had been, warriors, administrators, scholars, and in their final centuries, reluctant bureaucrats of a peace they had not originally been built for, continued to shape Japanese culture and identity long after their formal dissolution. Chapter 11: The Masterless Warrior. Not every samurai served a lord throughout their entire life, and the figure of the Ronin, a samurai without a master, occupied a particular and often precarious place within warrior society. A samurai could become Ronin for several reasons: the death or downfall of their lord, the confiscation of their domain by a rival, or by the shogunate itself, or in some cases voluntary departure from service over a materus, a principal or personal grievance. During Yude, when domains shifted hands constantly through warfare, Ronin were a common and somewhat expected feature of the turbulent political landscape, often finding new employment with rival lords who valued their martial experience regardless of their previous allegiance. The situation changed considerably once the Tokugawa shogunate imposed its long peace. Since the number of available positions for samurai employment shrank dramatically, while the practice of confiscating domains from lords who fell out of favor with the shogunate continued, producing large numbers of Ronin with genuinely limited prospects for re-employment. Many Ronin during the Edo period turned to teaching martial arts, working as scholars or tutors, or in some documented cases, drifting into poverty and social marginalization, a stark contrast to the romanticized image of the independent wandering warrior that later fiction would popularize. The historical reality of Ronin life was frequently defined by financial hardship and diminished social standing rather than freedom or adventure. Chapter 12: The Great Unifiers and Their Rivals. The Sengoku period produced a number of commanders whose careers left a lasting mark on Japanese history, and understanding their actual documented achievements helps separate historical record from later legend. Oda Nobunaga, a daimyo from Owari province, distinguished himself through ruthless military innovation, including early and effective large-scale use of matchlock firearms. At the Battle of Nagashino in his Tias Sansbury's peace, and through his broader campaign plan to bring ring rival domains und centralized control before his death in Beaton 6 PCCT during a betrayal by one of his orange generals. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, born to a lower status family's family and rising through military service under Nobunaga, completed the unification of Japan following his predecessor's death, eventually launching too costly, and ultimately unsuccessful invasions of Korea in the Imbiso's Okunis, yes, before his owns, Invis Indies, Clanetansi Ihix. Tokugawa Ieyasu, a patient and politically calculating Ali turned rival of both men. Both men ultimately secured lasting power through his decisive victory at Sekigahara in Occident Phyothia, founding the shogunate that would govern Japan for the next two and half centuries. Other regional commanders, including Takeda Shingen and Uesugi Kenshin, whose long rivalry and repeated battles at Kawana Kajuma became a legendary in later retellings, commanded significant domains and armies without ever achieving national unification themselves, their careers illustrating contested and entrance in the path to power remained throughout this turbulent century. Chapter 13, Seppuku understood correctly. Few aspects of samurai history have been more sensationalized in popular retelling than seppuku, the act of ritual suicide by disembowelment. Understood accurately within its historical context, seppuku served several distinct and specific purposes rather than functioning as a casual or quaint practice. It was employed as a means of avoiding capture and the dishonor associated with it following military defeat, as a form of capital punishment ordered by a lord or the shogunate for serious offenses, allowing a samurai to die with dignity rather than feign-face execution by other means. And number of well-documented later cases as an act of protest or loyalty following the death of one's lord, known as junshi, a practice the Tokugawa shogunate ultimately banned in the late 17th century precisely because officials came to view it as a wasteful loss of skilled retainers rather than a genuine expression of virtue. The ritual itself, when formally conducted, typically involved as a second, known as a kaishakunin, whose role was a swift beheading immediately after the initial kakat, a practice intended to ensure a controlled and dignified death rather than prolonged suffering. It is worth stating clearly that seppuku, while genuinely part of samurai history, was never an everyday occurrence, and the vast majority of samurai across the centuries lived and died without ever facing the circumstances that would call for it. Chapter 14. Ledgers alongside the blades. Particularly during the Lolong Tokugawa peace, the day-to-day reality for most samurai bore little resemblance to battlefield and foreign farmer resemblance due to careful, administrative work. Domains, known as Han, required extensive bureaucratic management, tax, assessment, and collection from farming villages, maintenance of roads, bridges, and irrigation systems, oversight of local justice, and detailed record keeping, all of which fell to samurai serving in various administrative capacities within their lord's government. Higher-ranking samurai might oversee entire departments of domain governance, while lower-ranking retainers filled roles as clerks, inspectors, or minor officials, a hierarchy of bureaucratic responsibility that closely mirrored the military hierarchy samurai had traditionally operated within. This administrative burden required genuine literacy, numerical skill, and familiarity with law and precedent, explaining why samurai education during this period placed such heavy emphasis on Confucian classics, historical study, and formal writing alongside continued, though increasingly, ceremonial martial training. Some domains developed reputations for particularly capable administration, and samurai officials from Well-Runham were sometimes recruited or consulted by other domains seeking improve their own governance. This transformation from battlefield warrior to seated administrator reflects one of the most significant, if less dramatically depicted, developments in samurai history. A class originally defined by its capacity for violence, gradually redefining itself around competent, disciplined civil governance. Chapter 15. Women of the Warrior House. Women within samurai households occupied a position shaped by genuine responsibility alongside a significant legal and social constraint. A samurai typically managed the household's internal affairs, finances, and the education of young children, a role of real consequence given the financial pressures many samurai families faced, particularly during the Edo period, and one that required considerable organizational skill. Discretion. Marriages among samurai families were frequently arranged with political and ethical and economic considerations in mind, cementing alliances between families or domains. And while personal affection between spouses certainly existed and is documented in historical letters and records, the primary function of samurai marriage was understood in terms of family and clan interest rather than individual romantic choice. Some women from samurai families are documented as having played direct roles in defense during moments of crisis, particularly during the more violent medieval and Sengoku periods. using the ninajinatapolier mentioned earlier to defend a household or castle when male retainers were away or unavailable, though such direct combat involvement was the exception rather than the ordinary expectation for samurai women. Confucian ideals promoted during the Edo period placed increasing emphasis on female submission, and domestic virtue within samurai households. A formal ideology that, as with many prescriptive social codes, existed alongside lived reality documented in surviving letters, diaries, and family records, in which individual samurai women exercised meaningful in influence within the more limited sphere available to them. Chapter 16. Samurai and Shinobi are real distinction. Popular media frequently blends samurai and ninja into a single, overlapping category of Japanese warrior. But the historical distinction between the two was genuine and significant. Samurai operated as an opan, legally recognized class with formal social status. Hereditary, privilege, and identifiable role-ins within domain, omian, and shogunate Yono government. Shinobi, more commonly known today by the popular term ninja, functioned very differently, typically operating as specialists in espionage, infiltration, subtraction, sabotage, and irregular tactics, frequently drawn from specific regions, most notably Iga and Koga provinces, where local families developed. Passed down these particular skills across generations. Rather than existing as a rival warrior class to the samurai, shinobi were often employed by samurai lords precisely because their unconventional methods, gathering intelligence, conducting overt operations, and executing tactics, considered dishonorable for a samurai bound by open combat. Expectations filled a genuine tactical need that conventional warrior forces were not suited or willing to perform. Store records of shinobi activity are considerably sparser, harder to verify than samurai military and administrative records. In part, because as effective espionage by its very nature left little documentary trace, a gap in the historical record that later popular fiction, with considerable embellishment, producing the exaggerated, supernatural abilities commonly associated with ninja in modern entertainment, elements with little grounding in the more modest, if still genuinely significant, historical illyry of shinobi operations. Chapter 17. Rice, coin, and rising tension. The long Tokugawa peace produced a slow but consequential economic transformation that placed increasing strain on the samurai class's traditional position at the top of Japanese society. Samurai stipends were paid primarily in rice, a system rooted in the agricultural economy of earlier centuries, while broader Japanese economy during the Edo period grew, increasingly monetized, and commercially sophisticated, driven substantially by the merchant class, the formal social hierarchy had ranked it beneath samurai, farmers, and artisans. This created a genuine and often uncomfortable contradiction. Merchants, formally positioned at the bottom of the social order, frequently accumulated considerable practical wealth through trade and finance, while many samurai, despite their elevated formal status, found their fixed ripeness increasingly insufficient against rising costs for goods that now moved through an expanding cash economy. Some samurai families fell into genuine debt to merchant moneylenders, a situation that inverted the theoretical social hierarchy in practical economic terms and generated real social tension across the period. Domain governments experimented with various financial reforms to address these pressures, including efforts to convert rice stipends more efficiently into usable currency and, in some cases, permitting samurai to engage in supplementary trade or craft work, itself a notable departure from earlier expectations, illustrating how thoroughly economic reality reshaped even the most formally rigid aspects of the samurai social order across the centuries of peace. Chapter 18: The Cultivated Warrior. Alongside their martial and administrative role is samurai, during the Edo period in particular, cultivated a rich tradition of artistic and cultural pursuit, the big pursuit that became closely associated with the ideal of a well-rounded warrior identity. Poetry, particularly the compact verse forms of waka and later haiku, was widely practiced among samurai, valued both as personal expression and as demonstration of refined education. Calligraphy, considered inseparable from disciplined brushwork and mental composure, was taught alongside martial training from a young age. The physical control required for fine rating understood as genuinely connected to the control required for swordsmanship. The tea ceremony, formalized significantly by cultural figures such as Sen no Rikyu in the 16th century, became a significant social and aesthetic practice among samurai elites, valued for its emphasis on ritual precision, simplicity, and mindful presence, qualities that resonated with the broader Zen influence on warrior culture discussed earlier. Garden design, ink painting, and theater performance likewise attracted serious samurai patronage. In some cases, direct participation, particularly among higher-ranking families with the resources and leisure time such pursuits required. This cultural dimension of samurai life should not be understood as separate from their warrior identity, but as a genuine extension of it, reflecting an ideal articulated with particular clarity during the peaceful Edo centuries, that true mastery required discipline and refinement across both martial and artistic domains simultaneously. Chapter 19: Behind Stone Walls. The Japanese castle, developing into its most recognizable form during the intense warfare of the 16th century, served as far more than a simple military fortification. It functioned as the administrative, economic, and symbolic center of a samurai domain. Earlier fortifications had often been simpler wooden structures built on defensible high ground. But the escalating scale and intensity of the Sengoku period warfare drove the development of massive stone-walled complexes, complete, elaborate, multi-tiered keeps, defensive modes, and carefully engineered approach paths designed to slow and expose attacking forces. Beyond their defensive function, castles became deemed the residence of the ruling daimyo and the administrative headquarters for domain governance, drawing samurai retainers, merchants, and artisans to settle in the surrounding castle town, which frequently inquiry into a domain's principal economic population gentash. This concentration of population around castle towns during the Tokugawa period, encouraged deliberately by shogunal policy requiring many samurai reside near their lord's castle, rather than scatter across rural estates as in earlier centuries. Fundamentally reshaped samurai daily life, transforming a warrior class historically rooted in the management of rural land into an increasingly urban population of salaried retainers and administrators living within organized, hierarchically structured castle town communities. Chapter 20: Law, Order, and the Samurai's Blade. Samurai held formal legal privileges and responsibilities regarding guarding the maintenance of orders, and this yet beyond Sparta field combat. During the Edo period, samurai were legally permitted, and in certain interpretations even expected, to cut down on a commoner who had committed a serious insult or offense against their honor, a practice known as kurasuchgomen, though historical research indicates this right was exercised with genuine restraint in practice, and was subject to review by domain authorities, who could and did investigate and punish samurai who invoked it without sufficient justification. More routinely, samurai served in law enforcement roles within domains, and particularly within the shogunate's own directly controlled territories. Staffed police and judicial functions responsible for or investigating crimes, maintaining public order, and enforcing an increasingly detailed body of shogunal and domain law. The formal legal codes developed during this period, including the shogunate's own legal frameworks governing samurai conduct specifically, reflected the class's dual OAO identity as both privileged elite and disciplined servant of an established order, granted real authority and real privilege, but bound simultaneously by real obligation and real consequence should that authority be abused, a balance that domain and shogunal administrators worked continuously to maintain across long one piece of the Edo centuries. Chapter 21. From warrior class to mort class turned nation. The dismantling of samurai legal pre-privilege following the Meiji Restoration unfolded gradually across the Teixti rather than as a single decisive act, reflecting, dictating the genuine complexity of transforming a centuries-old social order. Following the abolition of the domain system in ETP Sensensi Pin, which replaced the Han with centrally administered prefectures, the new government proceeded to abolish samurai stapens in imitsives infinitive sans, in etis sensimenti salts, converting them into government bonds whose value often proved insufficient to sustain former samurai families at their previous standard of living. The formal ban on publicly carrying swords, also enacted in Sensus Hatsuks, removed the most visible symbol of samurai identity and provoked significant resentment among former warriors who viewed the sword as inseparable from their honor and status. These reforms, combined with the introduction of a new conscript national army open to all social classes, rather than restricted to the hereditary warrior class, effectively dissolved the legal and military foundation upon which samurai identity had rested for centuries. The most serious armed resistance to these changes came in Pin Itinzismi Hisayan with the Satsuma Rebellion, led by Saigo Takamori, a former samurai, and initially a supporter of the Meiji government, who ultimately took up arms against the very reforms he had earlier helped bring about. A rebellion crushed by the modernized conscript army, whose existence symbolized precisely the transformation Saigo and his followers sought to resist. Chapter 22. What remained after the swords were set down? The formal end of samurai's status did not erase the influence of samurai culture and values from Chamvapu's Japanese society. Rather, it redirected that influence into new institutional forms. Former samurai, equipped with the literacy, discipline, and administrative experience their traditional education had provided, moved in insignificant in numbers into the new Meiji government bureaucracy. The modernized military and police forces and decashes, education and emerging industry, disproportionately influential in shaping the institutions of modern Japan, despite the formal abolition of their hereditary class. Values associated with samurai culture, discipline, loyalty, aesthetic refinement, and the ethical writings on Bushido composed largely during the peaceful Edo centuries were actively promoted by major era intellectuals and educators as a source of national identity and more moral education for the broader population, no longer restricted to a hereditary warrior elite, but recast us general ideal of Japanese character, available to all citizens of the new nation. This process of right interpretation continued into the 20th century, at times shaped by genuine historical scholarship, and at other times by political and nationalist agendas that selectively emphasized particular aspects of samurai history, while minimizing others. Understanding the samurai accurately today requires holding both realities in view: the genuine historical warriors, administrators, and scholars who lived across nearly 7 centuries of continuous transformation, and the powerful, evolving cultural symbol their memory became long after the last hereditary samurai had set down his sword for the final time. Chapter 23: A Land of Many Domains. Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate was not a single uniform society, but a patchwork of roughly 250 domains, each governed by its own daimyo and possessing distinct traditions, economic conditions, and relationships to the shogunate itself. Domains classified as tozama, or outer lords, families that had submitted to Tokugawa authority only at the decisive Battle of Sekigahara, rather than serving as allies before it, were treated with particular suspicion by the shogunate and often positioned at a geographic distance from the capital. In Edo, a category that included powerful western domains such as Satsuma and Choshu. These outer domains dispute, or perhaps because of their historically arm's length relationship with the central shogunate, developed distinct samurai traditions of their own, often maintaining somewhat more assertive martial training and a stronger, rare regional identity than domains more closely integrated into shogunate. This regional variation would prove historically significant centuries later, since it was precisely these outer domains, Satsuma and Choshu prominent among them, whose samurai played the decisive role in overthrowing the Tokugawa shogunate during the Meiji Restoration. Our revolution led substantially by lower and middle-ranking samurai from exactly the domains the shogunate had long regarded with wariness. Understanding samurai history accurately requires recognizing this genuine regional diversity, since a samurai's daily experience, economic circumstances, and even martial training could differ meaningfully depending on which of Japan's many domains he happened to serve. Chapter 24: The Farmers Who Fed the Sword. The relationship between samurai and the peasant farmers, whose labor sustained the entire warrior class, the service, careful, and honest attention, since samurai svusans anstis village rested directly upon an agricultural taxation system, extracted farm rural communities. Domain governments assessed farming villages for a portion of their rice harvest, typically calculated using in a formal yield assessment system with the collected rice then distributed as stipends to samurai retainers in exchange for their military and administrative service. This arrangement placed real and often heavy burden on farming communities, particularly during years of poor harvest. When fixed tax obligations calculated in ordinary years could push already strained households toward genuine hardship, a tension that occasionally erupted into peasant uprisings and protests across the Edo period. Historical events, domain administrators, many of them samurai officials themselves, had to manage and respond to directly. At the same time, the formal Confucian ideology promoted during this period placed farmers second only to samurai in the official social hierarchy, above both artisans and merchants, a ranking that reflected agriculture's foundational economic importance, even as it existed in some tension. The real day-to-day power dynamic between a taxing samurai administration and the taxed farming population beneath it. Samurai officials responsible for rural administration were expected to govern with a degree of paternalistic responsibility toward the farming communities under their authority. And the historical practice varied considerably by domain and in individual administrator. If unmistakably hierarchical relationship between samurai governance and peasant agricultural labor remained a consistent thread throughout the long Edo period. Chapter 25, Kawanakajima, or Rivalry in 5 Battles. Among the most extensively documented military rivalries of the Sengoku period was the prolonged conflict between Takeda Shingen of Kai Province and Wisugi Kenshin of Echigo, whose fortress met in battle at Kawanakajima on 5 separate occasions: Inizhins, Enbismis beat Imembits Zepisa Shorch, and Imit at Pishis Dorch. These engagements fought over control of the strategically important Kawanakajima Plain in Shinano Province, ranged from relatively minor skirmishes to the intense 4th Battle of Intestensatsu of Inisextb, which historical accounts describe as involving direct and costly combat between the two forces, though historians treat some of the more dramatic details preserved in later popular accounts, including a famous single combat between the two rival commanders, with appropriate scholarly caution, given the tendency of later Edo period restellings embellish earlier historical events for dramatic effects. What can be established with reasonable historical confidence is that neither commander achieved decisive victory across this extended rivalry, and both continued to rule their respective domains and pursue other military and political objectives elsewhere in Japan until their deaths. Shingen Gyumbyochu Yochuch and Kanchin in Imimivyapcha Sikis. The Kawana-Kajuma campaigns illustrate a broader pattern common throughout the Sengoku period: prolonged, less resource-intensive conflicts between evenly matched regional powers could persist for years without producing the kind of decisive territorial change that would fundamentally broader balance of power across the fractured country. Chapter 26: The Battle That Decided a Nation. The Battle of Sekigahara, fought on 15th of October in the year Pinzak, stands as one of the most consequential single military engagements in Japanese history, determining which faction would control the country in the aftermath of Toyotomi Hideyoshi's death 2 years earlier. Tokugawa Ieyasu led a coalition of Eastern Allied forces against a Western coalition nominally acting to protect the interests of Hideyoshi Heir. The two massive armies, together numbering well over 100,000 samurai and their attendant forces, according to most historical estimates, meeting in the mountainous terrain near the village of Sekigahara. The battle's outcome was decided in significant part by the defection of several Western coalition commanders during the fighting itself. Notably Kobayakawa Hideki, whose forces had been positioned on high ground overlooking the battlefield, and whose it was eventual choice to attack. His nominal allies, rather than support them, proved decisive in breaking the Western coalition's resistance. Ieyasu's victory at Sekigahara effectively secured his position as the dominant power in Japan, leading directly to his formal appointment as shogun in the Suksman and the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate would govern the country for the next 2.5 centuries, making this single a day of fighting arguably the most consequential battle in the entire span of samurai military history. Chapter 27: The Last Great Siege. The final major military conflict of the samurai era's age of large-scale warfare came in the winter and summer campaigns of Atsinhaxit Ins Ams At and Jinhaxuward and Taksu Ambas, when Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces besiege Osa Castle, the stronghold of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the son of the late Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and the last significant rival. Tokugawa Authority. Osaka Castle, among the most formidable fortifications in Japan, initially withstood the winter siege of Seksivonj through a combination of strong defensive works and skilled defense. leading to a negotiated truce whose terms, controversially, included the filling in of some of the castle's outer defensive moats, a concession that significantly weakened the fortress's defenses ahead of the Yinuent summer campaign of Binoxzel or Umbas. This second assault succeeded in reaching the weakening castle, resulting in its fall and the deaths of Hideori and his mother, effectively eliminating the last organized resistance to Tokugawa authority and firmly establishing the peace that would define the subsequent Edo period. The fall of Osaka Castle in Phoenix of Marts in Caxons is often marked by historians as the true beginning of the long Tokugawa peace, sometimes referred to by the Japanese term Jena and Enbu, Minbu, meaning roughly the cessation arms, a fitting label for the moment when nearly a century and a half of near continuere warfare finally gave way to the extended period of internal stability that would fundamentally transform the warrior class role within Japanese society. Chapter 28:8 Ancestors, Kami, and the Sacred Landscape. Shinto, Japan's indigenous religious tradition centered on the veneration of kami, spirits associated with natural features, ancestors, and sirs, and sacred sites, held genuine importance within samurai religious and cultural life, alongside the Buddhist and Confucian influences discussed. Ancestor veneration in particular carried significant weight within samurai family identity, since lineage, hereditary status, and the honor of one's family name formed the very foundation of a samurai's social position, making respect for deceased ancestors both a religious observance. Practical reinforcement of the family and clan structures samurai society depended upon. Domain lords frequently maintained close relationships with local Shinto shrines, providing patronage and support in exchange for the shrine's role in legitimizing and sanctifying their authority over the surrounding territory, a mutually reinforcing relationship between religious institution and secular power common throughout Japanese history. Many samurai families maintained household shrines dedicated to protective kami, or venerated ancestors, and important life events, including coming-of-age ceremonies for young samurai, and the beginning of military campaigns in earlier centuries, were dreamed to by Shinto's ritual observance, seeking protection and favor, rather than existing as a separate or competing belief system from the Buddhist practices discussed in earlier chapters. Shinto and Buddhism coexisted within samurai religious life in a syncretic relationship typical of pre-modern Japanese society morally and addressing different spiritual needs without the kind of exclusive religious identity more familiar in other historical contexts. Chapter 29. What a Samurai ate. The Samurai Diet. Particularly during the Pinda peaceful Edo period, reflected both the classes' formal status and genuine practical constraints shaped by geography, season, and household income. Rice formed absolute center of samurai died, an identity. Unsurprising, given that samurai stipends were themselves calculated and paid in rice, and a samurai's wealth and status were frequently measured in koku, a goku, a unit representing the amount of rice considered sufficient to feed one person for a year. Beyond rice, samurai households commonly consumed miso soup, pickled vegetables, and seasonal fish, particularly in coastal domains, while meat consumption remained limited across Japanese society generally during this period, influenced by Buddhist principles, discouraging killing of animals, though this restriction was applied with considerable practical variation, rather than absolute consistency. Closely associated with the cultural refinement discussed in earlier chapters, held both dietary and ceremonial importance, consumed daily as a beverage, while also serving as the centerpiece of the formal tea ceremony practiced among samurai elites. Samurai households, particularly higher-ranking retainers with substantial stipends, could afford greater variety and quality in their diet, while lower-ranking samurai, especially those facing the financial pressures described in earlier chapters, often ate quite modestly. Daily meals, considerably plainer than the elaborate diet pint, popular imagination sometimes associates with a privileged warrior class. A further example of how genuine economic variation within the samurai class shaped daily lived experience in ways the formal social hierarchy alone does not fully capture. Chapter 30. Guns, Crosses, and Closed Doors. The arrival of Portuguese traders in Japan in Yoskist Kurisatui introduced firearms to Japanese warfare, with consequences already discussed in earlier chapters. This contact carried a second, equally significant dimension: the introduction of Christianity through Jesuit missionary activity, most notably associated with Francis Xavier's arrival in Baix Cocos. Christianity initially found genuine converts among Japanese populations, including samurai and daimyo, particularly in the western regions of Kyushu, where Portuguese trade contact was most concentrated, before growing suspicion among Japan's ruling authorities, who increasingly viewed the foreign religion as a potential vector for European political influence and colonial ambition, led to escalating restriction and eventual suppression. Toyotomi Hideyoshi issued early edicts restricting Christian missionary activity in Imisat seats, Sevines, and the Tokugawa shogunate intensive siege, this policy considerably in subsequent gates, emanating in the brutal suppression of the Shimabara rebellion of Apinaxtit Otsianen Eads and Opsisiti, and Inotsitastes, an uprising with significant participation among its largely peasant and Ronian rebel forces, whose defeat marked the effective end of organized Christian practice in Japan for over 2 centuries. This religious conflict fed directly into the shogunate's broader adoption of a foreign policy historians refer to as sakoku, or closed country, formalized through a series edicts in the Cynics Centuries that severely restricted foreign contact, expelled most European traders and missionaries, and confined the remaining limited foreign trade conducted primarily with Dutch merchants who had demonstrated less interest in missionary activity than the Portuguese, to the small artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki Harbor. Imor. Chapter 331. A narrow window to the world. For more than 2 centuries following the Sakoku edicts, the small Dutch trading post at that Dejima presented Japan's primary, tightly controlled channel of direct contact with the wider world, a narrow but genuinely significant window through which European goods, ideas, and knowledge continued to reach Japanese society despite the broader isolation policy. Dutch traders, permitted to maintain this limited outpost specifically because Tokugawa authorities judged their commercial interests to pose a less religious and political risk than earlier Portuguese and Spanish contact had. Spavidans, who had provided access to European scientific texts, medical knowledge, and technical information that a specific class of Japanese, a school of Japanese scholars, known as practitioners of Rangaku or Dutch learning, studied with considerable seriousness throughout the Edo period. Some samurai, particularly with scholarly inclinations, or serving in domains that valued this specialized knowledge niche, engaged directly with Rangaku studies, translating Dutch medical and scientific texts, and, in some documented cases, applying this knowledge to genuine advances in Japanese medicine and other technical fields before Japan's formal reopening to broader international contact in the mid-19th century. This carefully managed, limited engagement foreign knowledge complicates any simple pictorial picture of Edo period Japan as entirely cut off from outside developments, revealing instead a more nuanced reality in which a genuinely closed curled and religious policy coexisted, sustained channel of intellectual exchange, one that would prove significant in helping Japan's eventual, remarkably rapid modernization following the country's forced reopening by Commodore Perry Perry's arrival in Isen and Sinitsitish. Chapter 32. Families. After the fall. The documented experiences of individual samurai families following the major abolition of their formal class status offer a valuable, more human-scale perspective on the broader transformation described in earlier chapters. Surviving family records, memoirs, and later historical research reveal considerable variation in how former samurai households navigated the sudden loss of hereditary privilege and guaranteed income. Some families successfully leveraged the education and discipline of their samurai upbringing in new careers within Meiji government service, the modernized military, or emerging professions such as law and education. Historians point when illustrating how samurai cultural capital, if not formal legal status, continued to shape Japan's new elite well into the 20th century. Other families experienced genuine and often painful economic decline, particularly lower-ranking samurai households that already struggled financially during the final Edo decades, and now lost even their modest fixed stipends entirely. Some documented cases describing former samurai forced into manual labor or small trade occupations their formal social status would have considered beneath them only years earlier. Government programs offering vocational training and resettlement assistance to former samurai achieved mixed results, and regional variation played a significant role. With former samurai from domains that had actively supported the Meiji restoration generally finding smoother paths into the new order's institutions than those from domains more closely associated with the defeated Tokugawa shogunate. These are individual family trajectories, preserved in diaries, local histories, and genealogical records, offer a grounded counterpoint to broader historical narratives, illustrating that the end of the samurai era was experienced not as a single uniform transition, but as thousands of distinct, difficult, individual and family adjustments to an entirely new social and economic reality. Thank you for watching my channel. Please subscribe and leave a comment